I hope you enjoyed the break. My name is Anneli Rådestad and I will be the moderator for this session, which will be very similar to the last session. We'll start with Konstanty Gebert, and then I will ask Paideia alumni to come on stage to open the conversation, to broaden the topic, to reflect on what Konstanty has said. Then we will open up for questions in the audience. And at the end, the last 15-20 minutes or so, I will ask Professor Lars Benchik to give some reflective comments on the whole conversation. So let's begin. I am very pleased to introduce to you Konstanty Gebert. He's a Polish journalist, intellectual, writer. He's also a very new member of the Paideia Academic Committee. He is the founder and the first editor of Midrasz, which is a Polish intellectual Jewish magazine, and he's the author of 12 books, among the themes being Poland in the post-war time, the Yugoslav wars, the Israeli wars, and European 20th century. Please.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Barbara, for inviting me. I don't know if she's in the room, but Barbara, you're a mensch, and we all aspire to be like you. Is she around? Whatever. You're still a mensch, regardless of whether you're in the room or not. Okay. When Barbara asked me to prepare something within the context of home, it was an opportunity to address an intellectual itch. I've been having problems with this expression, Beit, avadim, the house of slavery, bondage, labor, ever since I read the text for the first time, because the house of bondage, the house of slavery, seems a contradiction in terms, right? Well, she was right. A house is supposed to be a safe place. Bondage, slavery is anything but. It sounds like a kosher shrimp, like a sail-powered submarine. It doesn't make sense. But not only that, the entire sentence is bizarre. Because Hashem says, I am the Lord your God, who has liberated you from Egypt, the house of slavery. He already said liberated from Egypt. Why does he have to repeat the house of slavery, right? That's what he's referring to. Well, we know that when the Torah repeats something, it doesn't repeat it. It says two different things. So the most obvious interpretation would be that if Hashem had only said Egypt, this would mean that whatever he has to say refers to this one episode alone. And as we know, Egypt was just the first episode in many exiles and many different kinds of houses of slavery. So this is why he added the house of slavery, to make sure that whatever he has to say is relevant not only to this one particular historical moment. But this sentence is not just a Torah sentence. It introduces the Ten Commandments. This is, in fact, the first commandment. Hashem presents himself to us, telling us who he is. And he doesn't tell us he's the creator of the universe. Doesn't tell us he's the creator of man. He's not he who has revealed himself to our fathers. He opens the Ten Commandments with a statement that says, I am he who has liberated you from Egypt, the house of slavery. There must be something extremely important in this house of slavery to be included in this particular formulation. Now, let's put this aside for a moment, and let's try to look into the text and think, so what is it about Egypt that makes it a house of slavery, this contradiction in terms? Well, if you read the story of Exodus, what pops up time and time again is Israel complaining. Moshe leads out a very grumpy and unhappy nation, right? First time, it's even before they cross the Yam Suf. They see the Egyptians coming, so what they say? So were there not enough graves in Egypt? They had to bring us here for us to die. I can hear that, okay? I mean, this ironic inversion. Were not there enough graves in Egypt? You dafka had to do that? You Michiganer? And then they continue to complain, okay? So after 3 days wandering in the desert, they're down on water. So we should rather die in Egypt than here of thirst. Then, when they're not happy with the food, they understand that man and partner just eventually gets boring. They say, in Egypt we had fish for free, and onions, and leeks, and garlic. I cook myself. I can imagine myself sitting there and telling Moshe exactly, you Michiganer, what have you deprived us of? But this happens in a weird context. I mean, they've just been saved by as explicit a miracle as can be, okay? Hashem opens the Yam Suf so they can pass through and then drowns the Egyptians. If there is any guarantee that he'll take care of us, well, you can't demand more than that. And they complain. They wanted out of Egypt, right? They were submitted to slave labor. They had the Egyptians trying to kill their sons. It isn't exactly that Egypt was like Miami, right? There were good reasons to go. And yet they complain. As if there was a longing for Egypt. As if they missed it. And in fact, if you read the commentaries, they give two very different interpretations of what Israel was like at the end of their stay in Egypt. Some are just wonderful. They tell us, okay, as opposed to Egyptians who were really slaves and enjoyed their slave mentality, we maintained our integrity. There are subtle interpretations that say, well, we were slaves of Pharaoh, but not Pharaoh's slaves, right? The relationship was political, but it did not destroy our spiritual integrity. And there's a lot of texts that really make you very happy to feel Jewish. Wow, you really showed it to Pharaoh. Zohar says that when Hashem decided to close Yam Suf, an angel was complaining. He said, why kill the Egyptians? The Jews are just as much idolaters as the Egyptians. What's the difference? It's not only this wonderful situation when Hashem admonished his angels who are singing Hosanna over the killing of the Egyptians. He says, my children are dying and you are rejoicing. Well, we have a dissident angel who says the Jews are no better than the Egyptians. Why kill Egyptians to save Jews? Why were the Jews no better? Because they enjoyed participating in the barbarian customs of the Egyptians. And actually, one commentator says that of the 50 levels of degradation, Jews hit the 49th. I mean, one level below that and we would be beyond salvation. So you have very optimistic and extremely negative comments on what we had become in Egypt, which probably mean that the truth is somewhere in between. I mean, the commentators are not describing two different historical events, they are describing two perspectives on one event. And one extremely relevant commentator says that, well, actually, only 1 Jew in 5 left Egypt. Most of us were happy to stay. A commentator, and that commentator says, it was more like 1 in 50, not 1 in 5. So there must have been something about that exile that made us like it. We all know the Talmudic comment that the worst thing about the Egyptian exile was that we got used to it. And it's a very inspiring, freedom-inducing way of thinking, but you spend 400, or even if it was only 210, as most commentators say, so you said 210 years somewhere, it isn't a bad idea to start liking it. I mean, what were we supposed to do? Stand there in mute protest and say, we don't want to be here? We were not deported to Egypt. We went there because Hashem told us to go. Not only he told us to go, he said he'll be with us there and he'll lead us out of it. So Egypt was no abomination. It wasn't the Babylonian exile. It wasn't the Galut. It wasn't even exile. We became a nation, and a powerful nation, in Egypt. Before that, we were just the tribe of Abraham, a powerful tribe, endowed with a powerful promise, but no nation. We became a nation in Egypt, and that nation eventually took the land it was promised. Then, yes, then we were exiled repeatedly. In fact, exiled from exile at times. Egypt was no exile. So what was it? And why does Hashem introduce himself as he who had liberated us from Egypt, the house of bondage? Well, realizing just how much we liked Egypt, the expression house of bondage becomes less surprising, less paradoxical. Yes, it was home. We spent generations there. We got used to the place. We liked it there. So what about the killings of the firstborn? Well, the commentators say actually it was a very short period, okay? There was a high Stalinism. It was between the birth of Aaron and the birth of Moses. Just a few years. A small blemish on an otherwise respectable history. And anyway, the Egyptian midwives sabotaged the decree. And many commentators stress the fact that the Torah speaks about slavery in Egypt, but not by Egyptians. The Egyptians apparently didn't wish us ill, and there's empirical evidence. After the plagues, we asked them for their valuables, their golden dishes, their jewels, and they gave them to us. Okay, we despoiled them and run away with the goods. Point is, had the Egyptians hated us or held us in contempt, they wouldn't have shared their treasures with us. This is not what you do to a despised people. Apparently, the Egyptians liked us, and it would seem that we liked it in Egypt. Otherwise, we would not be hankering after Egypt on the very first day we managed to leave the place. Actually, we left only after the plagues. Yes, the plagues were to induce Pharaoh to let us go. But before the plagues, Moses makes the first attempt to convince us to go. And as you remember, he isn't very successful. We don't know what Pharaoh would have said if Jews would have agreed to leave the first time that Moses tells them to leave. Point is, the Jews said, no, we're not going. So Egypt, yes, was occasionally bondage and slavery. It was also home. We liked it in Egypt. Not only that, we became a nation in Egypt. Not only that, Nehemiah Leibovitz points out that there are mitzvot and halachot which originated only in Egypt. You shall not oppress a stranger because you were a stranger in the land of Egypt. You will buy out your brethren from slavery because you were slaves in Egypt. You shall give a departing slave gifts and presents because you were given them in Egypt. Just as there are mitzvot that can be observed only in the land of Israel, there are halachot that originated only in Egypt. Without Egypt, we would not have had them. And they form a very consistent group of halachot. They're about being sensitive to the needs of others. As if it was necessary for us to go through slavery ourselves, to be able to open our hearts to the slavery of others. As if Egypt was a fundamental formative lesson on our road to nationhood. So now we understand better why Hashem speaks of Beit avadim, why it is not enough just to say Egypt. Egypt is just a geographical location. The tension between the Beit and the avadim is a crucial message. But why is it that Hashem introduces himself as he who liberated us from Egypt and not as the creator of the universe? Well, he told us to go there, remember? And he promised he'll take us out. So what Hashem is doing in the first sentence of the Ten Commandments, he is reminding us that he has kept his word. He promised, and it was implemented. So just as I kept my word, you better keep yours. This is a compact. It's agreed. I took you out of Egypt. You shall not kill, you shall not steal, you shall not lie, etc., etc. Yes, this is what the Brit is all about. This is why he introduces himself through those words. How is that relevant to us today? We might say that this is a very interesting footnote to a historical event that possibly did not happen. What is the lesson we can draw from this today? Well, let's look at it. Let's say that only 1 in 5, and not 1 in 50, left Egypt, as the commentators say. Let us overlook, there's a fascinating, in the Midrash comment, that after the Jews crossed the Yam Suf, Moshe made them go on, as if there was some resistance to be broken. And the Midrash says that, yes, in fact, Jews didn't want to go, because the Egyptian army, apparently, was a bejeweled, okay? And once they had all sunk in the Yam Suf, the Jews were watching the shore. So we wanted to stay to pick them up. And Moshe had to really use all his authority to push us on, remember, towards Mount Sinai. So yes, this was a case in which we had to choose between acquiring some material riches that would do us strictly no good in the desert, against moving on to spiritual riches that would keep us alive forever. However, this is yet another example of how attached we were to that we were leading. So even if it was 1 in 5 and not 1 in 50, that's a great number of Jews left behind. And then we go complaining and grumbling and mistrusting in the desert. Although Hashem says Yesh Gevur, okay, I'm through with you. You'll stay in the desert for 40 years until a new generation arises and they can go into Eretz Yisrael. That's a horribly wasteful disposal of Jews, right? No, seriously. First, we leave 80% of the nation in Egypt to begin with. And then, even this 20% that did actually cross the Yam Suf, and incidentally, there are commentators who say that it's not even Nachshon we should thank for entering the waters. It was his sister Elisheva who encouraged Nachshon, saying, yes, you can do it, you can do it, you can do it. And encouraged by his sister, Nachshon makes the first move. One always wonders then whom the sister was talking to make sure that Nachshon will make the first move, to make sure that I mean, all of this hinges on so many improbabilities. But we do move on, only to be wasted in the desert. Only this generation that was born and raised in the desert, that knows nothing about the flesh gods of Egypt, that considers manna and the occasional partridge kind of natural diet, wouldn't probably know a leak from a hole in the ground. Only they can enter Eretz Yisrael and relearn culture all over again. The true Sabras, right? They're tough. They walk deserts. They fight. And then how do we learn it? Over and over and over again. The commandments that were born in Egypt about being sensitive to others have to be drummed into our heads. So yes, maybe slavery is also at home. Remember, slavery is an English translation. We don't have a good word for Beit avadim. It's the house of labor, hard work. Slavery, bondage, oppression. These are terms that we use in translation. But if it is so wasteful, and it is, to leave the overwhelming majority of the nation in Egypt, then one always thinks, what happened to them? We know that there is a rabbinic ban on going to Egypt, and we know that several centuries later there's a thriving Jewish community in Egypt that kind of somehow happened. Possibly it was the children of those Maranos who stayed behind. Possibly there were people who ignored the rabbinic ban and moved back. But it is tempting to think that maybe being less severe, less categorical, might have brought more of us along. We didn't have to leave 80% of the nation to the Egyptians. And then we can think of other exiles. The Babylonian, from which half of the Jews returned. That's already improvement, right? From 20% to 50%. That's a nice growth curve. And then exile after exile after exile. And in each of them, some return, most probably stay. But those who stay, of them we know more than of those who had stayed in Egypt and all trace of them is lost. They try to straddle the difference. I think, for example, of the Galicianer Jews of the early 20th century, who created an artistic upheaval, really artistic, intellectual, academic, really unseen in Europe since the Italian Renaissance. It occasionally happens that you have a geographically compact group of people that completely transforms the world. You think of the Kafkas, the Mahlers, the Freuds. They all had something in common. They all still were one way or the other with one foot in their Jewish heritage, much as they probably wanted to emancipate themselves and become like those 80% who stayed in Egypt. The contemporary Egyptians wouldn't let them, right? They would remind them they're Jews, and they need to stay where their place is. The other foot was in their newly acquired, assimilated culture, mainly German, but it could be Czech, Polish, Ukrainian, Hungarian, Romanian, you name it. Very eccentric choices. Their language, of course, German, the language of polite, educated, civilized society, and their head in the clouds. They were disproving by the very fact of their existence the idea that nationhood is about Blut und Boden, right? The idea that seems to drive us across the Sinai, until we remember that our escape from Egypt was not just Bnei Abraham. About 20% of those who fled were non-Jewish slaves who joined a successful flight of slaves. From the very beginning, we are not doing good. We're more than that. But in the Europe of the early 20th century, nationhood was about blood and blood. And those people acted as if nationhood was a supermarket in which you can pick and choose. I'll be half Jewish, half Romanian, German speaking, and I will produce culture, intellectual works, artistic works, academic works that will transform the world, and they did. Now imagine being a good European, okay? Of safely correct genetical descent on both sides, refuses to speak the languages of the bloody foreigners because he's true to his culture, and he sees that. A living insult to his identity. Somebody who says that, yes, I can pick and choose. I can produce myself. I am not a slave to who my grandparents were. If they were right, those semi-assimilated Galicianer Juden, then other Europeans were wrong. And, well, it depends on how you define right. But they certainly were creative to out-create everybody else. And it angered Europeans so much that, yes, they had to kill them. What other response to this outrage? And, well, we didn't kill, but we certainly were skeptical. I am reminded of the fate of the great Polish poet Julian Tuwim, who was of Jewish extraction, as it was politely said at that time, of Polish intellectual and cultural formation, who didn't speak Hebrew, who wrote some of the most extraordinary Polish poetry of the 20th century, completely transformed the language. And Polish kids start learning Polish poetry, reading Tuwim, in most cases not even knowing he was Jewish. But his critics in interwar Poland, of course, did know he was Jewish and made him pay for it. They viciously accused him of corrupting the Polish language by Judaizing it. And the most insulting thing was he wrote better Polish poetry than anybody else. But he tried hard to show he's not Jewish. He wrote anti-Semitic texts. He was trying desperately to prove that he can be just as good at Pole as everybody else. And then the war came. And he fled, found refuge eventually in the US. And in the US, realizing the horror that he had fled, he wrote an extraordinary essay called We Polish Jews, in which he proclaimed himself to be of the Jewish people by arguing that there are two kinds of belonging. That of the blood and that from the blood. Of the blood means that you are of the people into whom you were born. I reject this system. But there's a belonging from the blood. You are of the blood that was shed. And he says, I fully accept belonging to the Jewish people in the name of the blood collectively shed. A number of Jewish critics said, well, too late, Mr. Tuwim, okay? You shouldn't have been writing those nasty ditties 10 years ago. And where were you when we were organizing a congress to defend Jewish culture? You can stay with the Polacks. And of course, many of the Poles said, well, yeah, that just proves everything that we said. Izakai was masquerading as a Pole all along. Serves him right. And Tuwim died a very unhappy man, and his poetry is still unrivaled in the Polish poetry of the 20th century. In Egypt, Tuwim would have proudly stayed behind. Would be writing Egyptian poetry in hieroglyphs. And maybe some future Egyptologists would be even able to translate and discuss his poetry, not even knowing he's Jewish. I'm not sure if we can afford to waste the Tuwims. I'm not sure if we can afford to say that, well, the Galicianer cultural explosion was all good and fine for the Goyim, but it doesn't really mean anything for Jews, right? These people were not Jewish, they didn't go to shul, they were not Zionists, they didn't speak Yiddish, or if they did, they were embarrassed. We can try to repeat the performance of the flag from Egypt when it turned out that we really need to winnow ourselves down to the toughest, the hardest, really leave all that Egypt behind, and then start and create a world afresh from ground zero as if nothing had preceded us. Or we can try to be less wasteful. We can try to collect those Jews who felt that, yes, exile can also be hope. And that, no, it is not just giving our talents to the Goyim. We've got the commandments of exile. Do not oppress a stranger. Give gifts to the slave. Buy your brethren out from slavery. Commandments that probably do not occur to nations safe in their ethnic homes relying on their Blutenboden and absolutely sure they don't need to mingle with all this cultural corruption and pollution. We can either try to save this Jewish interaction with the world and make it not a concession to the necessities of modernity, but a foundation. Or we can turn our backs to it. 20 years ago, this topic wouldn't have even emerged. We all thought happily that this is the kind of world we're moving into, right? In which everybody is multi this and pluri that, and we're all just kumbaya. Well, it didn't work out that way. We're moving towards a world which is becoming markedly more nasty. And again, as in the past, enamored of simple words, simple identities, and one-way directions. This, in fact, is something that I find most striking about what happened after our exile from Egypt. For 40 years, we lived in a society that negated the past and ignored the present for the sake of the future. The only thing that mattered is that eventually we will move into Eretz Israel, and then our destiny will be fulfilled. Each time I read the description, I can't help but think there must have been a grandmother who said, well, why don't we just sit down for a moment, okay? Like, relax and try to look at this desert and see if we can eke out a living even here. There might have been a grandfather who said that, well, actually, there were good things about Egypt that we should not abandon or waste. Yes, there was, and there always remained, the spiritual danger of idolatry. We do remember the golden calf. But frankly, there are two kinds of idolatry. There is the naive and simple idolatry of the golden calf, the one that's decried by Isaiah, by the Psalms. They have eyes but do not see, they have legs but do not walk. I mean, those kind of idols are very easy to repeat. But there is the idolatry of taking something that is a value, and it is a value. It's a good thing. It can be love, family, country, and making it the supreme value. This is idolatry. As supreme value, we can only have God, and that is because He contains, or she, or it, all the values. Once we decide that something is most important, like getting to Eretz Israel, regardless of the cost, we are in the risk of idolatry not less, but more, than when we naively construe the golden calf and pray to it. Because yes, getting to Eretz Israel is a good thing. And had we not gotten there, we would be a footnote in the archaeological stories of the Middle East. But it is not indifferent how we get there and who we become once we're there. I don't think we can figure this out without Egypt. I think it's about time we rehabilitated Egypt, okay? It's been over 3,000 years. There must be a statute of limitations somewhere. And yes, we can rely on the Lord. He has liberated us from Egypt as He promised. He has kept His word. How about us keeping ours, okay? Stop killing, lying, stealing. Renounce idolatry. And also have some rachmunas for the Jews who were not possibly brave enough to leave Egypt. We don't have too many Jews to waste. We should try to include them, even 3,400